Welcome to Allies or Enemies. This time we are looking at tiny epic dungeons along with a bunch of expansion stuff. The review copy was supplied, but the thoughts are all ours. Tiny Epic Dungeons is a 1 to 4 player cooperative dungeon crawler designed by Scott Almes that drops a team of heroes into an ever-changing dungeon to fight goblins, minions, and bosses who are probably just minding their own business, but tradition is tradition. The newest game in the Tiny Epic series is pretty, it's big, and it's the hardest game to come out of this series yet. And we have a bunch to tell you about it. Let's start with how it's played.
In Tiny Epic Dungeons, your team of heroes will start on a single lit tile in an otherwise dark dungeon that you will be exploring until you have defeated all the minions, found the secret lair, and finally bested the boss. On your turn, you can do one blue heroic action, like disarm a trap, search, rest, which you'll do every time you start at 0 health, or most often, fight, which is a mix of close, ranged, and wizardy, all of which are decided with a clever dice system that has built-in mitigation with 1s and 2s that add to higher numbers and give you resources. Before or after your main action, you can also move, and any time in the middle of all of that, you can take any number of orange free actions. After you do your things, you move the torch 1 space down the timer track and closer to doom. You lose if the torch ever gets to 0, or if you ever need to spawn a goblin when all of them are already on the board. The torch track also is going to spawn goblins and make dungeon things attack you at set times, and the tiles you flip will also spawn goblins and tough minions and traps. And during all of this, you're going to be gathering loot, hopefully in theme sets that give you extra bonuses, because if you survive the dungeon, defeat enough minions, and find the lair, you move on to Act 2 and the final boss, who is epically tough. There are a few more small rules and a bunch of iconography that explains all of it, but basically, that's the gist.
If you are anything like us, you will play a lot because you will die a lot, like a lot. But always in a way where you know if you just did this one thing instead of that other thing, you would have made it, which makes it fiendishly addictive. It took us 6 tries to finally kill our first boss, and that was all in one day, and then we immediately played again. And it helps that the experience is always different. The dungeon unfolds in new ways. The characters all have different strengths. The gear you get changes your game plan, and so do the minions. And the bosses, if you make it that far, are all new challenges. We only got this one recently, and it is already close to becoming our most played Tiny Epic game. If you want a different challenge, the Potions and Perils Kickstarter mini expansion gives you one-use items with a price. And the story's expansion adds a bunch of new heroes, a few new bosses, minions, and goblins, a deck full of interesting side quests, and the very cool Epic Dungeon variant, which is a 3-level dungeon that gets increasingly harder as your team gets stronger. We've been switching between the variants and losing at all of them. If you missed out on potions, I wouldn't worry too much, but stories is well worth it. And the heroes especially add a lot of variety. But honestly, there is enough in the core box to keep you exploring and dying for a while.
This is a bit of a point of contention. Tiny Epic Dungeons plays fine at all player counts, but at lower counts, the difficulty ramps up from very hard to expert. At either 1 or 2 players, as one player's really just playing double-handed, you have a lot less time and a bigger target on your back. It's doable if you nail it, but you can easily fall into a loop of getting knocked out and resting and getting knocked out again. We found that we have the most fun when we play with 2 heroes each. That way, the time track gets longer, we have a better variety of specialties on our team, and there are more items to cycle through to make those coveted sets. And because upkeep is super simple, it doesn't add that much overhead. Some also suggest just playing 2 heroes, but starting at the 4 hero spot is a house rule, and we found that that does work fine, and it gives you a little bit of breathing room, especially as you learn the ins and outs. But at any player count, this is a game where coordination will be key. Every turn counts, and you need to have each other's back, which is both part of the challenge and part of the fun. Not unlike paintball, it can get scary, and it does hurt a lot, but when you pull out something awesome, you have stories for days.
We said off the start that this is Tiny Epic's prettiest game, and that starts with the miniatures. We had fun with the item meeples in other games, but the individual minis are a welcome change and way exceeded our expectations. The sculpts are excellent across the board, but that isn't the only place Gamelyn has stepped up. The dungeon tiles are terrific quality, and all of the art is great. Even the minions, which are a little pezzish at first, grow on you after a while. The goblins are particular standouts, being both individual enough to tell apart, but generic enough to represent all of the cards. The player mats also do a great job of giving a place to slot things in. This feels like the most that has been squeezed into a Tiny Epic box yet. And if you want a smidge more, you can also ante up for the boss meeples, although we die in the first act often enough that we've barely seen them. The one possible tricky will be the iconography, which, while not really a hurdle for seasoned players, could trip up new gamers. But the system does make sense once you have it, which should only take a game or two, after which you'll notice how much the lack of language dependence speeds everything up.
Let's cut to the chase. This is our favorite Tiny Epic game to date, but that does not mean it is without its flaws. The icons can be a hurdle for new players. The rules, while fixed by the online version, can be a smidge tricky, but most of all, it is hard, like really hard. If you succeed 25% of the time, you are doing very well. If you're batting 50-50, you should go and fight dragons for real. You will lose a lot, but you'll also figure out where you went wrong and you'll get better. It's a bit like an old school video game like Metroid in that way. You will die and learn and die and learn, which admittedly will frustrate some and will certainly having you look up house rules early on, which honestly you should use because the default game is a smidge too difficult. But that aside, the game is excellent. There's a weird amount of depth here. The system is elegantly simple but offers a sea of options, and the dice system is genius. Because the ones and twos are additive and provide resources, every roll is like a little puzzle that is usually solvable. It's infinitely better than the roll and hope systems that generally fill the genre. It isn't quite the depth of something like Gloomhaven, but it's punching way over its weight class, especially if you combine the base game with stories. This is the biggest game that the Tiny Epic folks have made yet, and if you want a portable dungeon crawler with some staying power, and you're not afraid to lose a bit, it cannot be beat. And that is it. Have you played Tiny Epic Dungeons? What did you think? And what other dungeon crawlers would you recommend? Please let us know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you all next time for another game.